Okay. So, question for us to begin our time today is racism an issue only between Black and white Americans? What are your thoughts?
I thought, of course not, but from their history, their issues has been dominant over other races. So
Mm-hmm.
it makes me bothering because sounds like there is only one kind of a racism exists or more important than other racism. So I try to bring my issues like Asians is not invisible. So I try to be our issues visible, like in our conferences like that, but they always say, oh yeah, I know it. And that's it. No more deep conversation or no more desire to learn. So
Okay. Well, Nami Muksaim, thank you so much for that comment. So, oopsie. So the next question then kind of brings us, right? So last week when we started our time, each of you sharing your most recent experience of racism, right? Every single one of you had something to share. Some were more blatantly racist, blatant racism. Others were like, I'm not quite sure, but it feels like it, or it feels little like off, right? So, are we as Asian Americans subject to racism in the United States?
Yeah, so of course I think because I watched a lot of the news regarding the violence and hatred against the Asians and the Koreans and the shootings. So, but
Yeah.
as Pastor Nami said, um, I mean the Black and the white Americans, they a little bit more silenced when they heard about the Asian race, the racism. So it was a little bit
Right.
frustrating because they talking about justice and more proactive action, but it is more um, the subsidized only their group, not other
Sure.
groups.
Right. So, yeah, I think so. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, right when Martin Luther King Jr. and all the African Americans were fighting against racism. It was mostly Black and white issue because it was the Black Americans basically speaking out and speaking up against these systemic, institutional, interpersonal racism that they were living with, right? And even like 60, 70 years ago, back then, just even just the number wise, right? There weren't too many Asians in this country yet, right? Other than, so we're going to go through the history. There were some Asians, but the percentage wise, they were very, very small. And even now, it's currently Asians are, I think Asians are about 6% of the total population. African Americans are about 12%, right? And then Latinos are about 20%. So, and then, like we say other, the people from other different parts of the world, they're so tiny, maybe 2%, 3% at max, right? So that's basically what makes up the BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, people of color. The Indigenous group is so small because throughout the history, basically about 90 what was the, is it 92% or 98% of the indigenous population have been wiped out in the last 200 years or so. So Native American population is also very small. So that's why, like, currently in the US, there are about 40% people of color and 60% whites. Okay, so if you really look at it, African Americans are only 12% of the 40% of people of color. And so, but 60, 70 years ago, obviously, the number was very different, right? It was, I don't have this, the data, but I would imagine maybe it was like 15% non-whites in the US 70 years ago. Right, and of the 15%, most of the 15% were African Americans, because the immigration from other, especially Asia and other parts were pretty closed until 1968, right? So 60, 70 years ago, when we talk about racism issue, it was not a far stretch to say, okay, it's an issue between Black and whites, right? And the struggle was mostly Black and white. There were some Asians who worked with Blacks, but obviously they were not very visible, or there were so, like, very few. 70 years later, in 2023, right? The racism issue is no longer binary, meaning it's just Black and white. No, it is no longer binary. It is not just the Black and white people issue. Now it encompasses so many more of other people. And so today, right, racism issue is no longer Black and white. And yes, Asian Americans are subject to racism, as Chongdong Muksanim shared. I mean, you've seen in the news, right? All the Atlanta shootings, all the anti-Asian hate because of the COVID, all of that. And then there's still more, right? We just don't talk about it, or we don't hear much about it. So yes, African Americans have long history, 400 years of history of oppression. And there's no debate about that. And we see it, we know it. But at the same time, just because they have been oppressed for 400 years, longer than other people, it still does not mean that they can basically overtake all of the racism conversation, because now we have so many others other than African Americans who are also living with racism, and who also have history of racism. And so this is why we are taking the time to learn about the history of racism for Asian Americans. Okay, so Latino people might be included in the white section. Actually, demographically, that's what they try to do. So if you see any government documents, I was at the doctor's office this morning, and so they had a section where it's what did it say? Ethnicity, and then it's like, I'm Hispanic, I'm non-Hispanic, and then like, I don't want to answer this, right? So that was that question. And then race, and I have to check off like, Asian, Black, whatever. So actually, a lot of Latino people don't even know that many of them are counted as white. So one of the DS that I know in Arizona, he said when he was born here. And so when he was born, right, he was checked off as white. But he would never consider himself as a white, nor any white people will see him as white. And so I think Latino folks are beginning to see like, what are they doing, right? It's because democracy is all about number game. And so now Latino folks are beginning to see, like, I'm not white, don't count me as white. Okay, so let's go on. So racism against Asian Americans have started from the very first moment that Asians arrived in the US. So white supremacy, I call it pagan 우월증, the belief that white people are a superior race and therefore should dominate all non-whites, typically to the exclusion or harm of other racial and ethnic groups. That's basically been the modus operandus, right? Especially in the US. So Black, Indigenous, people of color, including Asians, have been considered a threat to white supremacy and continues to be. So, I said earlier, there are 40% people of color in the US and 60% white people currently. And the trajectory is that in the next 20 to 25 years, that is going to shift, where the people of color will exceed 50%, which means then the people of color will be the dominant number-wise, and white people will be the non-dominant. And so that is scary thing for white people, right? I mean, it's like, it's, of course, it's you don't need you don't need PhD degree to see that is fearful thing. They're afraid they're going to lose the privilege, they're going to lose the power. And remember I said that, with democracy, it's a number game. Whoever has the most number, most people, most vote, basically wins the election, makes the policies, all of that. So democracy, because it's a number game, it's like when that number is going to shift, now that's cause for fear. And that's why the more people of color in this country, more threatening it is to white supremacy. Right? So, especially for the last 8 years or so, right? You can see the trend. So before Trump took office, there's been a fear kind of, underneath, like all these white people were beginning to see like, oh, what's going on. Once Trump came on scene, the way Trump got all the white votes, right, was, okay, we're gonna make America great again. Right? You heard that, right? MAGA, make America great again. It's not about making America a moral standard for the whole world to bring good to the rest of the world. It was about, we need to make America white, more whiter. That's what MAGA is all about. Okay, so that's what is happening in our society currently. That's one of the reasons why when Trump took office, all the white supremacy groups that were all underground, all of a sudden they all surfaced. And they started showing their support for Trump. They started raising their voices and letting their presence be known to the world. Okay? So, systemic racism through policies, government actions, it's been there. But as you will see, it actually started with policies against Asians. Okay, so we'll go through that. And anything and everything, all the policies, the system basically is designed to subjugate and exploit people of color. And we see that all throughout the history. When African Americans came, the slavery, that was subjugation and exploitation. You will also see it happen with Asians too. All right, any questions so far or comments, thoughts? All right, so we'll move on. So racism in the US, we could say racism against Black Americans kind of started from the eastern side of the US, right? Because that's where all the slave ships came from Africa and embarked on the eastern coast. Okay. Then we could say all the racism against Asian people started in West Coast, because it's not that there weren't any Asians before 1850. They were few, but it was so little, right? The numbers were so tiny. It really did not make any huge impact in the U.S. history until 1850, when group of Chinese were recruited, brought in through San Francisco to help build a railroad. Okay, so that's when the influx of Asian people came in the number that was noticeable. Okay, so remember again, democracy is all about numbers. It's number game. So when the number is so tiny, people don't notice. It doesn't matter. But once the numbers increase, people begin to notice. Then that's when oppression and the racism really begins in earnest, systematically, institutionally, in the whole society. Okay, so here's the history of racism against Asian Americans in the US. So it began in 1850, and there are different parts, different times throughout the history that really showed racism, right? Systemic racism against Asians. So in the beginning, 1850 is the beginning of Asian immigration to US. As I said earlier, up to 20,000 Chinese workers were recruited to build a transcontinental railroad. And this is huge project, right? So from California over the Rocky Mountains, or through the Rocky Mountains to build the railroad, that was huge. And so they needed workers. So they imported Chinese workers. So 20,000 were recruited initially to come and help build this. And so by 1870, Chinese workers represented 20% of California's labor force. So imagine, think about it, in California, right? 1 out of every 5 person was Chinese persons. Can you imagine what that would look like? And what that would do to white people living in California. So although it was 20% of California's labor force by 1870, it was still, on the whole, right, 0.002% of US population. And as 1 out of 5 persons in California were Chinese people, you know, then they started saying they are taking away our jobs. Does it sound familiar? Who have been saying this?
Trump.
Against who? Trump and a lot of white people have been saying this against who? Recently. Right? Against all the South Americans,
All the people.
immigrants, immigrants or South Americans who come, they're taking away our jobs. So listen, right? All these the comments that are being made, it's not anything new, but it's been repeating over and over and over again against different groups of people who come newly to this country. So by 1882, because there were such a cry of these people are taking away our jobs, and so there started a xenophobic propaganda called yellow peril. Have you ever heard these terms? So yellow peril, yellow, you know, it's a color, right? And oftentimes it's kind of derogatory remark for Asians when they say yellow something, right? What's peril? What is peril? Anyone? Song Muksa님, you are muted.
I think wipe out.
Peril, no. Anyone else? What's peril? What does that mean?
I
Danger.
think getting rid of
Or
It's like a danger.
falling them down.
danger. So yellow peril means yellow danger. All these yellow people are dangerous. Basically, that's the propaganda. So if you look at the cartoons to the left, right? On top, what are you seeing? A Chinese people with gun on one hand, knife on their mouth, right? And fire on the other hand, and who's lying down on the ground?
White guy?
White woman?
A white woman.
Woman? Oh.
It's a white woman bleeding, beaten down on the ground with this wild Chinese guy, you know, waving guns with knife in its mouth. And what is that telling? You know, what is this cartoon telling the people?
Asians are dangerous.
Asians are dangerous. And look what they're gonna do to our women.
Harmful.
who are
Humans.
who are helpless, right? And what about and so with these kind of xenophobic propaganda, they were like TV shows, movies that was made basically to portray that Asians are scary, they are dangerous, they are harmful. And that kind of propaganda continues even today. And COVID was a very, like, COVID was an example of that kind of propaganda, right? When Trump said, you know, Chinese virus. And so, and part of this propaganda was also these Chinese people with their long braid, right? So back then, the Chinese men had like a long braid down their backs. So they're unfit for citizenship in America. They're inferior race, and they're just a little bit better than animals. That was the thought and the propaganda. And so 1882 had the Congress voted to put in place Chinese Exclusion Act. This is the very first law in the US that barred immigration from a specific place solely based on race. So here, Chinese Exclusion Act is the systemic racism. Outright systemic racism, barring any Chinese people from entering into US. And so the Chinese must go, that was a movement, Chinese must go, we have to get them out of our country, out of our area. It was so strong that Chinese immigration to the US declined from 39,500 in 1882 to only 10 in 5 years. So you see the cartoon on the left where Uncle Sam, right? You all know Uncle Sam is holding up a paper, right? That's the proclamation, Chinese Exclusion Act. So no more Chinese and kicking a Chinese person on the butt. Right? So that 1882 was the very first time US actually put in systemically a racistic policy against Chinese for the first time in the US history. And then 1898, there was a Spanish-American War where US-America won, right? Because the war was because Spain actually colonized western part of US, Mexico and northern part of US all the way up, I think most of California. And so US entered into a war and US won, right? So when US won the war, right, all the colonies of Spain became US property. So US then took all the land on the West Coast, right? California and all that. And then also took over Philippines, because Philippines has been Spanish colony for a very, very long time. I think it's over 100 years. So Philippines became a colony of US following the Spanish-American War. Now, the rationale for colonizing Filipinos, again, like if you listen, it's the same language, same thought process, right? They are unsanitary, they're dirty people. They're physically inferior. So if you look at the cartoons these are actual cartoons, right? That was circulated back then. So if you look at them, like you see under Spanish oppression, industrial slavery, and then you see they're yoked like cows, like beasts. So they're physically inferior and they're unfit to govern themselves. So we're going to go in, we're going to bring civilization to them, we're going to give them the freedom, we're going to educate them, tell them, help them to get justice, right? So they go in with the mindset that we're going to do so much better for these people. Because the Spanish, who's been there colonizing them, they really did bad for these people, right? So there's a term for this kind of thinking. It's called white saviors. We're gonna go in and save these poor people. So the Philippines became part of US property. So, poor Philippines, they just went from Spanish colonizers to American colonizers. Now, I just put this in there because we are also part of this Asian history. So 1904 started Korean immigration to US. Right? A small number of Korean immigrants first came to Hawaii, right, to work in the sugarcane plantation. And then from there, they moved to mainland. And all of this were happening during the Japanese occupation of Korea. So when Koreans first came to US, to Hawaii, and then to mainland, which means mostly California area, they were manual laborers, right? Working as agricultural workers. And also when they came to the mainland, California, they also worked in railroad building. And so the Koreans who came, I would say that they were experiencing double racism, right? Being here in the US soil, they were experiencing racism. And also back home, right? They experienced Japanese colonization, which is another form of racistic oppression. So, and then you also, that they're Korean patriots, 독립투사들, right? They political exiles who worked for the Korean independence. They were also small number of people, but they were also part of the Korean immigration to US in the early 1900s. All right. And so then, so you see the pattern, like a wave of Chinese people came first, right? 1850s for about 30 years. And then the US decided, no, too many Chinese, we don't want too many Chinese. So they put the policies in, and so the Chinese immigration basically stopped, right? 10% a year, what's that? That's nothing. So once the Chinese stopped coming, then they still needed someone to do all the dirty work. See, as much as they say they're taking away our jobs, right? White people don't jump in to do all the work. See, white people did not build the railroads because that's backbreaking work. That's hard work. So they still need other people to come and do the work for no money or very little wages. And so the Japanese people started coming in after the Chinese stopped. Chinese immigration was stopped. And so Japanese started coming in, and they were doing a lot of agricultural work and so forth. And then they begin to see like, okay, we're getting too many Japanese here, right? Now we are seeing too many Japanese. So 1913 and 1920, California state put law in place where aliens, they call it aliens, Asians, except Filipinos, were fully excluded by law. So the Filipinos only because they're part of US colony, right? So except Filipinos, all Asians had no right. Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, and Indians, they were denied citizenship and naturalization. They were not able to own or lease property. And they were prevented from marrying whites. Okay, that was the law that was put in California, 1913, 1920. And then 1929, the Great Depression hit. So when the economy is doing well, the immigrants actually, even, you know, in spite of all the racism and all of that, immigrants do fare well. But then when the economy is not doing well, then what happens? Immigrants become the scapegoat, right? They start blaming everything on the immigrants. And so the racism and economic depression during the Great Depression was now being focused on Filipinos. Because you see, by now, Chinese people were no longer allowed to come, right? And the Japanese and Koreans and Asia, you know, the law said you can own any property, you can own land, you cannot become a citizen. So the Asian group basically at this point have no right at all, except the Filipinos. So, and the number of Filipinos were increasing at a very fast rate because they're able to come to US, right, without too much issue. And so during 1929, there were a Watsonville riot. It's a town called Watsonville in California, where a group of white people went into this town where it was mostly Filipino, and they just started shooting. And so, you know what, you could Google and read some more about all of these. Also, remember, one of the mantra is they're taking away our jobs, right? So especially during Great Depression, there's no job, right? It was so difficult. So what the white people were doing is they would have do not employ Filipinos pact. So in area, some of those, you know, area leaders will come together and say, okay, you know what, we need to let our boys, right, our people have the work. So all of the farm owners, plantation owners don't employ Filipinos. So that started going around. If anyone defied it and hired Filipinos, then there'll be, like, you know, mobs come middle of the night, burn their field or something for someone who hires Filipinos. And there were a lot of violence against Filipinos at this point. And then by 1935, another policy, federal policy, was put in place called Tydings-McDuffie Act of 1935, where they limited the annual quota of migration. Now, they call this migration because Filipino is part of the US, right? So they're not immigrants, they're migrants. And so they limit the quota to 50 per year, right? So now this is second time the US government have put policies in against Asians. All right. And then there was the World War I and the World War II. And what happened with World War II? What was World War II about?
The war against the American Japanese troops were they lost, and so a lot of the countries, they were liberated from the colonization.
Okay, so World War II, right? It was basically a war between the Germans, right? Nazi Hitler, Germans, and Japanese. They were the one team against the rest of the world, rest of the Europe and US, right? That's so during that war, February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 to incarcerate people under suspicion, all the Japanese descendants, as enemies, and they put them all in the internment camp. Right? You've heard that. You heard about it? Or have you never heard about this? So during the World War II, as US and Europe were fighting against German Nazi Germans and Japanese, right? They rounded up all the Japanese people in the US, put them away in the internment camp. They had to leave everything, their livelihood, their property, their home, and then they were just put on a train, shipped somewhere in the middle of the country, middle of nowhere, as you will see, like middle of the desert. They will just put buildings together, and then that's where they were for 3 years, just because they were Japanese, just because US was in a war with Japanese and Germans. Now, interesting thing is, see, World War II was against Hitler, Nazi Germans, and Japanese. There is no record of US government doing anything to German descendants, but just the Japanese. They were all rounded up and put in the internment camps. And by being put in the internment camps, they lost everything. And many of these Japanese were naturalized citizens or second and third generation Americans. But just because they're Japanese, they were taken from their life, put in the internment camp. Overnight, all of their lives was just turned upside down. So 1943, a year after the Japanese American incarceration, Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Whites advocated for the repeal, not for the Chinese migrants, but to advocate for a Trans-Pacific alliance against Japan and the axis of power. What is this statement saying? So remember the Chinese Exclusion Act that was put in place by the federal government by 1882, right? So this is like after 60 years. They stopped receiving immigrants from China, and now the Congress was working to reverse the Chinese Exclusion Act. Why? So this is how politics work, right? So now US is fighting with Japanese, right? So as they are fighting against Japanese, they're now trying to open the door for Chinese, basically as a way of saying, you are our friends, let's be friends. So that you and we can work together and we can defeat Japan. So you could see that like Asians are very, the position of Asian Americans are very sensitive to the geopolitical happenings in the world. Did you hear me? Did you get it? Right? This is very important. So these days, right, there you see in the news, right now, US and Chinese relationship is very testy. Right now, they are not on good terms. Yesterday, Secretary of State Blinken went to China, right? Now they're meeting, they're talking. Hopefully, in the hopes of making Chinese-American relationship a little bit friendlier. All of these little political stuff that is happening around the world, we have to pay attention because as Asians living in the US, it's going to affect all of us, our community, our family, our children. And there's no guarantee that things like this, internment of Japanese Americans, will never happen again. See, things like this can happen just like that overnight. This is like why it's so important for us to learn and know the history. So Japanese internment happened, the war ended, and then in the US, the civil rights movement began to take place. Right? With Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, there were like, basically the civil rights movement began to really take place 50s and 60s. And by 64 is when Martin Luther King was assassinated, right? And the whole world basically came to say like, oh my goodness, we need to change, or at least, we need to do something. So influenced by the civil rights movement, non-restrictive annual quotas of 20,000 immigrants per country were established. So 20,000 from China, 20,000 from Asia, Korea, 20,000 from India, that's what started. So all the restricting laws from 1882, right? That was reversed up to 20,000 per year. And so, if you look at, think about Korean immigration history, right? A lot of Koreans who are living in the US currently, they started coming to US after this Immigration and Nationality Act passed. So for the first time in US history, large numbers of Asians were able to come as families. So back in 1850, when they started importing Chinese people to build the railroads, it was all men. And so the family were not, like, they could not come. Or even when Koreans came, it was all men who came first. And then, right, 그 한국말로 뭐죠? 그 사진 보고서는 브라이드 해갖고서는 한국에서 와서 여기서 결혼하고 그랬잖아요. Do you remember? Have you ever heard that story? So 1904 한국 사람들이 왔을 때도 it was all men. 그래서 그 사진을 다 보내와 갖고 사진을 보고서는 거기서 고르면은 그 여자가 왔어요. And that's how they met, they got married, and they started a family.
So they never dating each other in person?
No, they didn't ever even saw each other in person until
Got married?
until the woman came and started living together as a, you know, as a couple. So 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act was very, very different, right, than all the other immigrations in the past. So this was a good thing in one hand, but also you have to see, you know, it's like the catch. The catch for US was that this was a good way to do brain drain from all these other countries. Brain drain. Have you heard those terms?
Mhm.
Yeah. So the 20,000 immigrants per year actually basically became a brain drain for a lot of these Asian countries. And it continues to be in a way. Okay. Then in 1980, Refugee Act was enacted following the war in Vietnam. To bring more than 500,000 Southeast Asians to come to US and live here after the war, right? Because these were all, they call it Amerasian Homecoming Act. So all the foreign-born children of American soldiers, right, in Vietnam and Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War. So well over 1 million Southeast Asian refugees have immigrated to US since Vietnam War through 1980 Refugee Act. So then brings us to 2020, when the Asian American anti-Asian hate soared during COVID-19. So you've probably heard a lot of these statistics. 3 out of 10 Asian adults, 31%, say they have been subject to racial slurs or jokes. Majority of Asian Americans say it is more common for people to express racist views toward their group since the COVID outbreak. And in the first 8 weeks of pandemic, right, in early 2020, Stop AAPI Hate website has received 1,843 reports of anti-Asian discrimination. This is in the first 8 weeks, and probably there's a lot more because there were more people who didn't even know about this website that they can go and report. So this is history of Asian racism against Asian Americans. in the last 170 years. So, Nami Muksanim said earlier during our time, well, the Blacks have endured a lot of racism, and yes, they have. The slavery, like these 400 years of hell in the US. But it does not mean that they basically, racism is only their issue, right? They have experienced their racism. So are the Asians, for the last 170 years. Just as Black Americans were lynched, right? Asians were also lynched. And so we have to move beyond, like, okay, whose pain is bigger, right? Whose wound is deeper, right? Wound is wound, pain is pain. Experience of racism is experience of racism. And so rather than, yours is bigger, so it's more important to you, no. It's all of our issue. It's all of our pain. It's all of our history and our wound. And so in 2023 and beyond, the racism issue in the US need to now move beyond Black and white and be more inclusive of all people of color, including the indigenous Native Americans. Because, if you really, if you also think about it, so we don't really talk too much about Native Americans, but they also have suffered tremendously. So before the America was discovered, right? If we say discovered, it's like, really? No one was living here? No, there were 120 million Native Americans living here already. It's just that white person came and discovered it. So actually it was here, they didn't discover anything. There were 120 million people living here already. But through the history, 400 years, they wiped out over 90% of the population. So every group, all the Black, indigenous, people of color groups who were here or who came later, everyone experienced racism. So what are the learnings through looking at the history? Is that acceptance and inclusion of Asians in the US has been and still continues to be very conditional. Right? So when things are going well, and when it benefits white people, when it benefits US government, then Asians are embraced. Oh, you're so good. When it works against them, or if they don't like it, then we are rounded up and put in camps, internment camps. Okay, it's very conditional. And it changes from, time to time, depending on what is happening. Either Asians are looked favorably, or they are the yellow perils. Acceptance and assimilation, the model commonly used to explain European immigration, like the melting pot paradigm of immigrant assimilation, does not work for Asians. Why not? Why does it not work for us?
Because we don't want to be brainwashed for being white. They try to make us whiteness, you know, like a
Okay. Well, I think a lot of Asian wants to be white or at least identify with white, but it does not work. It does not work because our looks will never change. Even if you are here 10th generation, right? Our Asian skin, our Asian feature will not change unless you keep intermarrying and intermitting and mix. So see, the Europeans, when the Europeans started coming to US, right? So they also came in different groups. So at one time, all the Irish came, right? And then they were discriminated against. But after the second generation, they were assimilated. And no one could tell whether you're Irish or not, where you came from. When the Germans came, right? When the Italians came, the first generation was different. They stood out. But from the second generation on, they assimilated and they became just part of the big white chunk because they look alike, right? And they're able to assimilate without any issue. Whereas Japanese people, they've been here second, third generation. And when the war broke out with Japan, they were all rounded up and put in an internment camp because they just looked different. That's racism. Remember, I said, I wonder why they did not round up all the Germans. Because US was in the war against German and Japan together. But there was nothing against Germans because they already assimilated, right? They all look the same. So for you white Americans, it's okay. You look like me. You're safe. But for Japanese, you look different from me, and so different means danger. Because you look different, I cannot trust you. So we're gonna put all of you in the prison, basically. It's an internment camp is another form of prison. So yeah, the melting pot paradigm does not work for anyone who's not white. Asian Americans are subjected to racism in this country, and we are not immune from it. Okay. So we must join the Black, Indigenous, people of color, work together to dismantle racism. Because clearly all of you have your own experience of racism. And if we don't do anything now, then you know, our children will continue to experience racism. Okay. Any questions so far? Questions? Thoughts? What are you feeling?
Asians also has a long history that we never heard, or we never studied. It's been there our ways, but it's not
Yeah.
recognized enough, even still to me as an
Yeah.
Asian. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering what makes the difference between the information, like, who has the power decide to
Mhm.
focusing on which history. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, obviously, this kind of history is not taught in schools. And you know that in the last 4 or 5 years, right, there has been a lot of backlash against even teaching the history of African American slavery in the public schools. Right? Have you been reading on some of those conversations that's been going on in the last 4 or 5 years? So, the so there is resistance among, in the white communities. They don't want to learn about these history. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want their children to learn because they say, well, it's going to make our children feel bad. And you have to wonder, seriously? It's like millions of people have been killed. They died under these oppressions. And people don't want to teach their children because it's going to make them feel bad. That's the mentality that's rampant in this country. And then there's so many of the BIPOC people, like Black, Indigenous, people of color. We don't know the history. And so sometimes when I go do workshops and trainings in different parts of the US, sometimes I have Asian people come to me and say, oh, this country is so nice. They welcomed us and they are giving us all these opportunities. And I just smile and I walk away. It's like, yes, this country is good for you in that way. But you have to also understand there were so many before you whose lives were taken away, whose livelihood was taken away because of racism. So it is important for us to understand the history and know what's going on. Any other thoughts about the history and what we talked about so far?
Can
Yes.
I? Yeah, actually, you have been here for a long time, so I want to ask you: do you think there is a racism between Black and Asian? I think I met many African American who ignore Asian.
Mhm.
So I think, do you think that is the part of racism or the what else or anything? I don't know how to define that mood from here. I could feel.
Okay. Can you clarify your question a little bit more?
So
So who's they?
what I mean, the Black people,
Okay.
African American or any Black. Do you think that there is the racism between Black and Asian? What I mean,
Yes.
the Black
Yeah,
people
so-
ignore the Asian, and then they
Right.
show very aggressive attitude toward the Asian.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So
Sure.
Is
So
it part of racism?
I want to say no. So it's
Mm.
not racism. It's just it's sibling rivalry. You know what sibling rivalry is?
I don't.
Siblings, yeah, siblings 형제,
Yeah.
right? 형제를 sibling이라고 그래요,
Yeah.
right? What's rivalry?
Rival.
Rival. What's
Rival.
rival? right,
compete.
right? So it's basically, I see the struggle between Black and Asian Americans are like sibling rivalry.
Hmm.
So oftentimes, and so this is another part of the history, and I hope that you will take time to do your research and learn, right? There are incidences in the last 70, 80 years where there has been conflict between Blacks and Asians, and a lot of times Blacks and Koreans. So, for example, in the 1970s, there was huge riot in California, LA. LA 폭동. 들어보셨어요?
Yeah.
Right? That was basically all the Korean businesses were in the Black neighborhood. So a lot of Koreans who, the first generation Koreans who came to US made their money having businesses in Black neighborhoods, whether it's in LA or in New York. I've seen it like in the 70s when I first came. A lot of first generation Korean Americans had fish markets or fruit and vegetable store in the Black neighborhoods. And they made a lot of money, right? And then they moved their families out to suburbs so that their children can get good education and all, live in a nice neighborhood. So as the Asians and Koreans begin to like really make their lives better, then the Blacks in the slum area, right? They begin to be resentful. See, these Asian people, they come to this country, they have businesses in my neighborhood, they make all the money, and then they are taking it away, right? Moving away. And they are not contributing to the community where they are making money. And then, add to that, yes, there are discriminations, right? So Korean people also have anti-Black discrimination ingrained in us, right? So whenever we see Black person, what do we say? What's the word we use?
깜둥이?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
It's so there is that discrimination, right? So the business owner will say, oh, these, right?
Hmm.
Will they don't work, they're so lazy, they come and steal. So there is all of that interwoven.
Hmm.
And so what happened with LA 폭동, right? LA riot is that the Black people, there was Rodney King, I think that was his name, who was killed by the police. Now the police is definitely white, but when one of the Black young men was killed, then just like you've seen what happened, right? With when George Floyd was killed by the police, right? So all the Black people got angry, and there was a riot, and within their neighborhood, who are the businesses? All the Korean people. So they started going and destroying all these businesses. So the LA 폭동, it was basically, it didn't start Black and Koreans, it ended Black and Koreans. And while all of this was going on, where were the white police? They were by Beverly Hills area, protecting Beverly Hills properties, just in case all these Black people who are rioting would come that way.
Hmm. So because I have questions, so when you mention about the racism, it comes from the supremacy. So our ethnic is better than other. But I think that when Black attack the Korean store, that means I just guess. Is it from there we are better, but why they have more the wealth and why they have good business because we've been there more than we are better than them. But is it kind of the supremacy or
So it's not about racism when we talk about these conflict between Blacks and Asians and conflict among people of color. That's why I said it's sibling rivalry.
yeah? So only we can say the racism between white and other color.
So racism, it is very, very closely connected to power. So white people currently in this situation in our society, racism is with whites and people of color because whites are the ones with power, right? They are the ones with privilege. And they are the ones who's pushing white supremacy, that whites are the best people. The rest are not. And so we have to be on top and we have to make sure that you stay on the bottom. That's racism. Okay, so with racism, there's the power dynamic that you cannot disconnect.
Mhm.
So among people of color, there's discrimination. And yes, we look down upon other people of color, right? So remember we said there's interpersonal racism, right? And internalized racism that we talked about. So that can be part of the racism, but in terms of big systemic racism, right? It's white against people of color. So in a way, all of us are racist. We have that tendency. That's the sin in us. You know, anytime I judge other people based upon their color, skin color, anytime I judge other people because their culture is different, right? That's interpersonal racism that all of us we have to work on. And then all of us, you know, because we were brainwashed or taught growing up that we were taught to be afraid of Black people, right? That's the anti-Blackness that is very active, whether, you know, consciously, unconsciously. Okay. Did I answer your question, Kyusung Muksa님?
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Okay, so can we move on? All right, so what can we do as pastors to dismantle racism, especially as you're all serving in mostly white congregations? So do what you can. Do what you can. That would be kind of the answer, right? Do what you can to dismantle racism. Here are a few things. First is that we have to overcome our own cultural inclinations and dispositions to keep harmony and stay quiet. Especially for us, Korean Americans, Asians, this is probably like the biggest thing that we have to work on and overcome because of our culture, right? We've been taught 조용히 하고, right? Harmony, don't make any trouble. That's basically part of our culture that we grew up with. So keeping harmony has been very important. And so to keep harmony, we are taught to stay quiet. But we are not in Korea. We are not in Asia. We are in the US, where culture is very different. And if we don't speak up and if we stay quiet, we're just gonna be, we'll continue to be ignored. So we have to raise the consciousness of people around us, especially when there's talk about racism, right? We have to say, hey, we are part of that too, right? We also have been subject to racism in this country. We have 170 years of history, and we continue to experience racism in small ways, in big ways. You know, I said earlier, currently there is a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the US government, right? It's been going on for the last 4 or 5 years, and it continues, especially with the war in Ukraine, right? China is you know, they are very good friends with Russia. And so the Chinese government is so the US government is guarding against Chinese government, right? And then what's another threat is like, oh, now that the Russia invaded Ukraine, what if Chinese invades Taiwan? Right? So now all of that is going on. It's important for all of us to know what's going on. Because remember I said earlier, everything that happens, geopolitical meaning all those things that are happening in the world will affect all of us here in the US. So do you remember in Esther, Mordecai says to Esther, because now Esther is queen, she's in the palace, right? She is very well protected. Mordecai says, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal positions for such a time as this. Who knows that God has brought you here, called you to ministry, put you in all of these churches, serving mostly white congregations for such time as this. So being silent is being complicit in the injustice of racism. So you know, as we are thinking about anti-racism work, and the more I am doing this work within our church, with various conferences, anti-racism work is so tied to our spiritual discipline. I don't think we can say we follow Jesus and not do this work. Are you hearing me? It is so intertwined with who we are as a person, as a community, as you know, in the US. And don't get me wrong, the US is not the only place in the world where there's racism. Yeah, there are plenty of racism in Europe. Anywhere you go in the world, there's racism, because anywhere you go, there's always one group who has more power, who has more numbers, who who oppress other people only because they can. Right? So there's racism everywhere. And so we are called as people of Jesus to stand up and announce that the kingdom of heaven is here by showing different ways of being, following Jesus's examples. So biblical and theological articulation, when we stand up there on the pulpit, right? We need to teach our people. We need to tell our people about what the Bible says about racism, what that means, what it means to be, part of what it means to be Christian in this world where there is rampant racism. So yesterday was Juneteenth Sunday. How many of you mentioned Juneteenth on Sunday? So yesterday, Monday was Juneteenth Day. Sunday, has anyone mentioned about Juneteenth Day? It's a great opportunity to talk about what Juneteenth Day is all about. There was actually a video that UMCOM had created, which was really nice, very well done, that you can just show it to your congregation, right? It gives the history, what Juneteenth Day is, what it signifies, and what we are called to do as the church, and what United Methodist Church is standing up for. So anytime, any opportunity you get, we have to proclaim the word. Preaching, okay, small group studies. Those who want to live according to biblical truth have a political responsibility to try to bring about the kingdom of God as much as possible and as soon as possible. If the church is to remain faithful to its Lord, it must make a decisive break with the structure of this society by launching a vehement attack on the evils of racism in all forms. So as we are teaching and preaching and trying to help our people understand and see, one thing is, I really encourage you to be intentional about learning about racism, learning about the history, learning about what is going on currently in the world, right? So, and that means you have to take the time to do your research, to read about it, to reflect on it, to read books. There are a ton of books, a lot of good books on history of Asian Americans in the US. There are articles, movies, docuseries. NPR has a very good documentary about African American history from the Middle Passage to slavery to Jim Crow, to what's happening now. They also have a good documentary on Koreans and Asian Americans. So you know what? So take a day and do a binge watching on some of these series that you could find on YouTube or anywhere. Recognize your own privilege. So with Asians, it's a very, Asians, as Asians, our position is very precarious. And we talked about this a couple times already as we were looking at the history. So Asians we are very privileged compared to Blacks. The fact that Asians can come to this country, start a business, and make money, their children can go to all the good schools, that's a privilege that many Black people don't have. They never had that privilege, and they still don't. Because as Asians, see, our proximity, our distance to whiteness is much closer than the Black people. So rather than letting the Black people have those privileges, the Asians have been given that privilege. So recognize your own privilege. And recognize that the history of racism keeps repeating with different players. You know, they're taking away our jobs, right? It was said against Italian Americans when they first came. It was said against Asians when the Chinese and when Asians came. It was said against, right, Mexican Americans, South Americans. It is being said to South Americans as they are trying to find better life in the US. So it keeps repeating with different players, and we have to do the work of stop this cycle so that it does not keep repeat with different people. Paulo Freire is from which country? South American. It says, washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Right? There's no such thing as being neutral. Either you are on this side or that side. So, and then the next thing that we can do to continue to fight racism is by confronting our own racism, our own anti-Blackness. Because that's part of, you know, that's who we are as people of Christ. Consider others better than yourself, right? Others, especially who are darker skinned, who are Black. And kenosis, you all know. So this is what Martin Luther King said, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality, right? This is what Jesus meant when he said, we are the body. And then the last thing that we need to do is we need to be engaged in our community and politically. So I don't mean that you have to be out there with the, you know, with the signs marching every day. That's not what I mean. Voting, be aware of what is happening in your community. Remember, so be aware of what is happening in this country, what is happening in the world, so that you as a pastor, you are able to teach your congregation, you are able to help your congregation see, so that they can also be part of the changing agents in the world. Okay, so final thoughts and questions. Any questions or thoughts?
I have a question. So you have been talking about racism and the discrimination. So I've been aware of the discrimination against the people of colors, but sometimes in the I was wondering the United Methodist Church, and also sometimes I see also the reverse discrimination because the people of color, they emphasize really about the discrimination and the openness, but but they are more. Sometimes they regard the male white people as like the sinners because they have the lot of privileges. So I'm wondering, the United Methodist Church, they also aware of the reverse discrimination where they are doing regarding that.
Okay. All right, I'm going to open this question up to all of us. You heard the question. What do you think about reverse discrimination? And please unmute yourself and start sharing. What do you think about this? This is a very good question.
So can
And
I?
I'm
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, sorry.
No, go
But
ahead.
yeah, can I share one experience? Because in our Upper New York conference, it was a few years ago, when at the annual conference, we had a time to vote for the trustees for the conference level. But I don't know, it was intentional or not intentional, but the trustee, the candidates, they are all the white people. So, but so some people they came front and then they tried to make like the principle or rule that in the group in the at the conference there have to be some the color of people. So and then I thought that because I don't know what is in the backstory, but they were on the floor to be voted, but at the floor some people they try to make a rule, and then I feel like that they exclude those who are already on the vote. So that caused me to think about the reverse discrimination that what happening.
Okay,
Sorry.
it's okay. All right, so what do you think? Is there reverse discrimination?
Discrimination against historically
against
privileged,
historically
so
privileged,
like
and it
against the
is
white groups.
against especially white males.
Okay.
Because I mean you hear this often, right? As anytime we talk about racism and discrimination, the white people will start saying, well, I feel like I'm being discriminated against
Right.
only because I am white,
I'm not a
I'm
racist.
male. Yeah, and I'm not a racist, right? You are being racist by discriminating me, right? They will turn it back on you.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
One of my congregation was very kind of upset toward me whenever I preach about the racism at least once a year. And intentionally, for the last 8 years, every year, no matter what church I was appointed, at least one book we studying in the church related to racism. And some old white woman who was a very great supporter for Trump, as I know, she came to my office and got very upset and said, why do I need to hear that political words from the pulpit? Why do I need to study this in the church? So first I said that, hey, I don't want to make you feel guilty. I always say that, like you say, I am also racist. I was born and grew up in Korea, but I didn't know I was a racist. So I also confess my sin. I'm not talking about the white group. I'm talking about all races matter. So I don't intentionally, I don't like to use Black Lives Matter, because it sounds like it focusing on one particular group. And in my congregation currently, I have a Ghanaian immigrant. So I have it. So I try to make a stand in the middle of them. Like, hey, I don't support for any one group.
Mhm.
But that's what I usually heard, that I don't want to feel guilty. Why do you make me guilty? Because I'm a white, that I was not chosen. I don't choose to be white from my birth.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. So there, okay. So straight answer, at least for me, there's no such thing as reverse discrimination. All right. So here's the dynamic. You know, when we talk about racism and discrimination, and especially within the United Methodist Church or in any organization, as they are trying to equalize, right? So at any time we talk about racism and discrimination issue, we also talk about equity, because because of the racism, there is unbalance, right? So white people who are currently in this system, they are the one with power, right? They have a lot more power and privilege compared to people of color who are down here, right? So the part of this work is to equalize things. So remember in Isaiah, the image that the verses that we read every year during Advent is that the hills will be brought low, the valleys will be lifted up, right? Do you remember that language? Because there is such a difference between the power, the privilege, the haves and the don't haves, because of the disparity. In order to have it equal, if they have some equity, it means that the people who have need to share, need to put it down. They need to be brought low. People who do not have, who are down here, who are powerless, they need to be lifted up so that we can all be together in equity. So when, with white males, basically, if they want to participate in this work, it means that they have to then give up their privilege. Sometimes it means that they have to give up their seat in the leadership table. Oftentimes I hear all across our denomination, whenever I go work with conferences and so forth, oh, we need to have more diversity, right? We need to have more diverse people be part of this table, part of this conversation. But you know what the problem is? In order for them to have the diversity around the table and have more diverse people come, it means that people who are already there around the table, they have to get up and make that space available for other people to come. And that's the work of the privileged in order to exemplify what Jesus did for us, kenosis, right? Jesus, who himself being God, did not consider himself to be God, but lowered himself, came down to the human level, right? He had to lay aside all the privileges and power of being the God and became human. And so that's what needs to happen if you are in the privileged group. And so when that is asked of the white people, white male or white female, and they don't want to give up their seat, they don't want to give up their power and privilege, that's when they say, I'm being discriminated against. This is the reverse discrimination. Right?
Yeah.
So that's why I said there's no such thing as reverse discrimination.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we are almost out of time. Last week and today, there's a lot of content. I hope it didn't, I hope it wasn't too much for you. So let's just share, what is one thing that you take away from our sessions? One thing you learned, and one thing that will change you, or one thing that you're going to do differently, or one thing that you want to do. So here's one learning and one action. And we'll just share it quickly, and then we'll close our session. So we'll do mutual invitation. So may I invite Taehwan Ro Moksanim? Could you start us? Taehwan Ro Moksanim, you need to
Yes.
unmute yourself.
Mhm.
So one learning and one action, please.
I wanted to share one story, short story. Sometimes when I talk to native speakers, I feel like I'm being ignored when they end the conversation without waiting for me to say everything I want to say. But I went to Walmart this morning and couldn't find the light. So I asked an employee where it was. She was Spanish and did not speak English. So she spoke to me in Spanish and I didn't understand it. So I just said I'd look it up by myself and ended the conversation and turned around. At the time, I thought that I was ignoring her. I didn't mean it, but rather I thought that it might not be that the native speakers were ignoring me unconditionally. So I thought that racism wasn't something only Asian could face, that I could do it as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Okay, thank you. So going forward, when you are in situations like that, what would you do differently?
I think before facing that situations, I need time to practice and I need the time to think, because unconsciously I could do it as well. So before facing that situation, I think I need to prepare for that as well. So I'm learning this class.
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you. Who would you like to invite to share next?
On my screen, I could see Jongdok Park Moksanim.
Thank you for your invitation. And the one thing I learned was don't forget the past and pass it on to the next generation. And also, what would I do is I try to be more myself, and then I will not be quiet, and then more say louder who I am, and then where I am and what I am called to be. And I'd like to invite 이성호 목사님도 초대해도 되나요?
그럼요.
Yeah, I'd like to invite Pastor Song Lee.
Well, Grace lecture is always wonderful and I learn a lot. So I cannot just pick one, but I learned about Asian immigrant history and the challenges that they face long before I experienced racism. So I think the root of racism is so deep. So what I'm doing and continue doing is to have some teaching moment in my local church ministry, either not just a formal presentation or sermon, but every time when I have a teaching moment, I'm using it as a chance to share about my learning.
Mm.
But one thing that I found out is that my presence itself is a good teaching moment and education to the church. When I was in Concord for 12 years, the first time when I was appointed, it was 99.9 white congregation. When I leave after 12 years, 20% of the congregation is Asian. 20%.
Mm.
That means Asians came and they decided to stay. So Filipinos, Chinese, Indians, and Japanese, no Korean, but every Asian but Korean stays. So
Okay.
we have about 35, 40 Asians. And
Okay.
now in Central, the church that I'm now serving, already have a 20% Asian. But now I think it will be really multiracial church. So I don't know about your situation, but your presence itself is going to be a big message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Who
And
would you
I
like to invite?
Namiyu.
Thank you. I'm learning Asian history, and I will do what I can do as a pastor.
Okay, thank you.
I invite Seung Kim, pastor.
I learned that the racism against Asian is not that different from racism against African American. And also, while I was listening to Pastor Grace the lecture, I tried to reflect myself whether I have internal, the racism or some kind of just came out of, my internalized learning or, something like that. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. And so I will help my congregation to realize they have their own internalized prejudices and racism, because sometimes I hear them just came out of their internalized interpersonal racism or whatever. So I think the beginning step is to help them aware of what they have right now. I don't think it's not going to take a short period of time, but whenever I have any biblical passages or preaching or Bible study, I'm trying to strategically help them aware and also change their mindset so that make this world, everyone be happy. Okay. I invite Joseph Sung 목사님.
Thank you for your invitation. Actually, I think I didn't want to. Okay, can you hear me? Oh yes. I didn't want to express about racism because I think it is influenced by the Asian education, I think. But as the Pastor Jong-Dok Park mentioned, so I don't want to pass racism situation to the next generation. So especially the Esther the passage that touched me. So I thought that I need to learn through the Bible study and then I think I need to say or mention the racism on preaching. Maybe sometime.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to invite Pastor the Reverend Young Lee.
I take away the long history of racism against Asian American and also Native Americans and Black African Americans. It's a long history, and now that I'm now in the US, I learned that I have to take all of them and learn from the history of racism and make this place now our home a better place because it's still messy.
Mhm.
And I also thought of, as we brought up the questions about racism against different people of color, I also thought of model minority myth and how it influences the view on Asian Americans, thinking that Asian Americans are better than like other group of people of color, and the problem with this model minority myth is that it makes people think that if other people of color do better, just like Asian Americans, although it is a myth, they can be better like group of people. So when in fact it is evident that there is racism in place. So, and it is not true that all Asian Americans are rich or doing better, or they're all legal and so on. So I take away all this interconnected racism and issues that are in the US. Although it is difficult, I take away the importance of cleaning this mess. So thank you so much for this lesson.
You're welcome. Thank you. Who would you like to invite next?
I would like to invite Austin Lee 목사님.
Thank you for your invitation. So before I take this course, I thought that racism is only from people, because I experienced the racism from people when I was in Australia and here in US. But I found that there are more, the various way can be the forcing power to discriminate the people as a racism, like the politic or structure. So I found that I need to study more to figure out what is the part of the racism around me to combat or make a movement for me, but for other people, especially, with all the different colors. And then I also I also find that I need to inspect myself, whether there might be any kind of racism, because I also has the privilege. So I just wanted to figure out, so what is the part of my racism, but the not the real racism, but the part of racism to exploit other or things. So thank you. The lecture. It led me to think about more.
Thank you. Thank you. Would you please invite 박명은 목사님?
No invite.
It was good to learn about the Asian, the racism against Asian history. I think I would love to make sure the sessions or programs of educating the racism against Asian into the, our mandatory racism training in our conference. So wanted to address them more actively. Hopefully they can be included in the racism training in our conference too.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we heard from everyone. Yeah. Okay. Any last thoughts before we go? I'm sorry that we went over time. Okay. Let us pray, and we'll close with prayer. Holy and gracious God, when you created this world and when you looked at it, you said it was good. It was beautiful. We are so sorry, Lord, that your good world has been marred by our sins. And as we learn about racism, all the violence and all the horror and all the things that has been done against oppression that has been done against a group of people only because their skin color is different, only because their culture is different, only because they look different. Lord, it hurts us, and I'm sure it tears your heart. We ask that as you have called us to serve you as pastors, shepherding your people, may we be the leaders that you call us to be as we teach about Jesus, his ways to love you and love others, so that we can begin to address the sins of racism in our church, in our communities, in ourselves, and bring about the kingdom of heaven here on earth, as Jesus called us to proclaim. We thank you so much for each and every one of these pastors. We ask that may the Holy Spirit empower them, fill them, so that as they pastor and as they proclaim your love boldly, that they will do so with courage, with wisdom, and make a difference in their church, in their communities, and in the world. Thank you once again for your grace, for your love, for each and every one of us, and for our world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your Madang webinar.